Dennis Collins spent more than 2 decades inside Richard Rawlings' world, close enough to have a front-row seat to everything that actually happened inside Gas Monkey Garage, yet quiet enough that most people never thought to ask what he genuinely observed about the people he watched arrive, contribute, and then disappear. He was not a cast member. He was not subject to network contracts or production schedules. He was something rarer and considerably more dangerous to a carefully constructed public narrative, a genuine friend who could walk through those garage doors whenever he wanted, see whatever was actually happening, and leave without owing anyone an explanation. Dennis has started talking now. And what he has said about 5 specific people from Fast and Loud, people he worked alongside, respected, and in some cases genuinely liked, reveals a side of that garage that the cameras were never positioned to capture. The closer you get to the last name on his list, the more the entire story of Gas Monkey Garage starts to look different than it ever did on television. Before getting into those names, it is worth understanding exactly why Dennis Collins's perspective carries weight that most outside observers simply do not have. His friendship with Richard Rawlings goes back more than 2 decades, forged long before either of them was associated with television. They met at a Harley-Davidson rally and discovered they shared the same obsessive relationship with automobiles and the same appetite for pushing things to their absolute limit. That shared sensibility eventually produced one of the more remarkable automotive feats in recent memory. The two of them broke the legendary Cannonball Run record, driving a 1999 Ferrari 550 Maranello from New York to Los Angeles in 31 hours and 59 minutes. That is the kind of thing you do with someone you trust completely. Dennis's own credentials in the car world are not borrowed from his association with Richard. He built Collins Brothers Jeep in 1984, a shop that became nationally respected for its restoration and conversion work on Wrangler and CJ Series Jeeps. He assembled a personal collection of over 200 Austin Healey's. He owns the very first Nash Healey ever produced, from 1950. His estimated net worth, built entirely through his own expertise and business instincts, sits at $30 million. Cast members, crew, and Richard himself treated Dennis differently than they treated cameras or producers. He was trusted. He was allowed into conversations and moments that never made it to air. And he was paying attention to all of it. What he observed across the years Fast and Loud was in production was not a series of isolated incidents involving difficult personalities. It was a pattern. Talented people arrived, contributed significantly, and then departed under circumstances that ranged from quietly sad to openly explosive. Dennis watched this happen 5 times. The frustration that accumulated across those departures is what he has finally started to put into words. The first name on that list is also the one whose departure hit the hardest, not just for Dennis, but for anyone paying close attention to what made the garage genuinely work. Aaron Kaufman was not hired to be a television personality. He was hired because he could build almost anything with his hands, and what he built consistently exceeded what anyone had a reasonable right to expect. He was self-taught, which in the automotive world means the knowledge was earned through trial, error, and an obsessive commitment to understanding how things actually function. He had joined Gas Monkey Garage before the show existed and had risen to lead mechanic through the straightforward mechanism of being better at the job than anyone else around him. Dennis watched Aaron work over multiple years and was direct in his admiration. The mechanical intelligence Aaron brought to the garage was not the kind of thing you replace by hiring someone else. It was specific to him, developed over years, embedded in how the garage operated at its highest level. When Aaron wanted to pursue complex, ambitious builds requiring extended timelines and genuine creative investment, he was not being difficult. He was being exactly the kind of craftsman he had always been. The problem was that Fast and Loud needed something different. Television builds operate on tight schedules with defined budgets, and the cars that make the best television are not always the ones the most talented builders most want to make. Aaron wanted large-scale custom projects that demand weeks of focused attention. The show needed projects that could be completed and packaged within a production calendar. Those two things were fundamentally incompatible, and no amount of goodwill on either side was going to change that. Richard described Aaron's departure as coming completely out of left field. That is a significant admission from someone who was present for the entire trajectory. It suggests that even Richard did not see the break coming the way it ultimately arrived, and that gap between what was visible and what was building beneath the surface is exactly the kind of thing Dennis, watching from his vantage point of genuine proximity, was positioned to notice long before anyone else. Aaron left in 2017, establishing ArcLight Fabrication in Dallas and later earning his own television projects. For Dennis, this departure represented the first clear demonstration that the show's success was beginning to cost the garage something real. Something irreplaceable. What came next was a different kind of departure entirely, Less about creative differences and more about what happens when the human cost of a relentless environment finally becomes too heavy to carry. Not every difficult exit from Gas Monkey Garage followed the pattern of creative tension or explosive confrontation. Christy Brimberry's departure sits in a category entirely its own, and understanding it requires setting aside the framework of workplace conflict that shapes the other stories on this list. Christy was the operational backbone of the garage in ways that rarely made for compelling television but were absolutely essential to how the place functioned. She handled the financial side of the business, managed the daily chaos of running a working garage that was simultaneously a television production, and did it with sharp humor and genuine competence. Keeping a complicated enterprise functional from the inside is not the kind of work that makes for exciting footage. It is, however, the kind of work that becomes painfully obvious the moment it stops being done. In October of 2016, Christy was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. She underwent emergency surgery to remove a cancerous lymph node, a procedure that caused damage to the nerve controlling her larynx. She lost her voice for an extended period and required chemotherapy and radiation to complete her treatment. She left the show in 2017 citing her health, and by December of that year confirmed publicly that she was cancer-free. Dennis, watching Christy navigate a health crisis while embedded in one of cable television's most high-pressure environments, found it difficult to reconcile. The garage had extracted enormous amounts from the people who kept it running, and the idea that someone as central as Christy could end up departing under those circumstances sat badly with him. His frustration was not directed at Christy. It was directed at what the show demanded from the people inside it, and at the recognition that the environment made no real room for human fragility. That is not a minor observation. It is a structural one. The next name brings the story back to direct conflict. And this one ended in a way that left very little room for interpretation. Tom Smith's departure from Gas Monkey Garage was not gradual, not mutual, and not open to the kind of interpretive ambiguity that softened some of the other exits on this list. It was a firing, delivered after a direct confrontation with Richard Rawlings that apparently crossed a line from which there was no practical return. Tom had been a recognizable and genuinely capable presence on Fast and Loud for a significant portion of the show's run. Not the most technically refined mechanic on the team, but someone who brought energy, willingness, and a personality that translated well to the format. The combination of skilled work and watchable presence made him useful and valued, which is why the circumstances of his exit felt particularly stark. The confrontation that ended his time at the garage reportedly involved Tom speaking to Richard in a way that Richard considered unacceptable. The specific language used has been described in subsequent accounts as the kind of direct, profane challenge to authority that most employers, regardless of industry, treat as an immediate termination event. Richard made his decision quickly. And it held. Dennis, observing all of this with the accumulated perspective of someone who had been watching the garage dynamics for years, had a specific reaction to Tom's departure that was different from his response to Aaron's or Christy's. With Aaron, the loss was about creative incompatibility. With Christy, it was about human cost. With Tom, what Dennis found himself most frustrated by was the pattern it confirmed. This was not the first time a talented person had reached a breaking point inside that environment. The specific incident was new. The underlying dynamic was not. What happened after the firing added an interesting dimension. Tom did not leave the automotive television world. He co-founded Misfit Garage alongside Jordan Butler, another departed Gas Monkey mechanic, together with Thomas Weeks and Scott McMillan. The show aired on Discovery, operated explicitly in Fast and Loud shadow, and ran for several seasons before concluding. It never quite reached the audience numbers that Fast and Loud had built, but it established itself as a legitimate enterprise rather than a failed imitation. Years later, Tom and Richard sat down together publicly to discuss their history, a reunion that neither side had obviously telegraphed and that suggested some degree of genuine resolution had occurred privately before the cameras rolled. Dennis observed that reunion with the particular interest of someone who had watched the original falling out and understood the full context of what preceded it. His frustration with Tom's departure was never personal animosity. It was frustration at a recurring organizational dynamic that seemed to require escalation before it could be addressed, and which left a trail of departed talent in its wake. The next name shares some surface features with Tom's story, but the specific detail attached to it changes the character of the conversation entirely. Jordan Butler's departure tends to get grouped with Tom Smith's because of their proximity and timing and their shared destination at Misfit Garage. Both left within a similar window. Both had their exits attributed in general terms to conflict with Richard. But what Tom Smith said publicly about the incident that precipitated both of their departures gives that explanation considerably more specific content, and introduces something that sits in a different category from creative tension or workplace friction. According to Tom's account, the breaking point involved a fan with cystic fibrosis who had come to the garage specifically to see one of Richard's cars and take photographs. The fan's interaction with the vehicle reportedly prompted Richard to respond with language and behavior that Tom found unacceptable, and that crossed a line for him professionally and personally. Tom has described this moment as the point at which staying became untenable. That word, untenable, was not chosen casually. It is the word of someone who had already made a decision before the decision was announced. If that account is accurate, it represents something different from everything that preceded it. It describes a moment in which the values operating inside the garage conflicted with something more fundamental than production schedules or creative direction. Dennis Collins, whose own reputation in the automotive community is built partly on his engagement with charitable work, contributed to the Gas Monkey Foundation beginning in 2014, supporting children, veterans, the elderly, and wildlife conservation, with combined donations and vehicle contributions that reached over $300,000. That level of personal investment in how people are treated, particularly vulnerable people, is not a peripheral aspect of who Dennis is. It is central to his value system, which makes the reported circumstances of Jordan's departure one of the more pointed sources of frustration in his account of this entire period. And it makes you go back and look at every departure on this list and wonder exactly how long the gap existed between what was being shown on television and what was actually operating inside those walls.